Trump said the ceasefire ends Wednesday. Then Tuesday afternoon he extended it. With no end date this time. Iran's government was described by Trump himself as seriously fractured, and Iranian negotiators had gone silent for days. The Iranians told Pakistan they might not even send a delegation to the second round of talks. J.D. Vance was sitting at Joint Base Andrews ready to fly to Islamabad. Then the flight was cancelled. And nobody could say what happens next. That is not how wars end. That is how the next phase of a conflict takes shape while everyone is still trying to figure out if the first phase is actually over. To understand what the new Middle East plan really looks like, you have to step back from the daily ceasefire headlines and look at what Washington and Tel Aviv said they wanted before the first bomb fell on February 28. The Trump administration articulated multiple goals for Operation Epic Fury, and those goals shifted and expanded throughout the conflict in ways that revealed the underlying strategic ambition. The stated objectives included ending Iran's nuclear program, degrading its ballistic missile capabilities, stopping its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and achieving what Trump and his advisors described at various points as regime change in Tehran. Those objectives were not sequential. They were simultaneous. And they pointed towards something much larger than a military campaign against a specific threat. What Israel and the U.S. were pursuing was nothing less than a fundamental restructuring of the Middle Eastern security architecture. The architecture that had been in place since 1979, in which Iran used its network of proxies, its nuclear ambiguity, and its geographic control of the Strait of Hormuz to project power and deter direct military pressure, was the target. Not just Iran's missiles or its nuclear program, but the entire system that made Iran a regional power capable of threatening American allies and American interests across 6 countries simultaneously. That ambition explains why the opening strike killed not just the supreme leader but the entire top tier of Iran's military and intelligence command structure in a single coordinated operation. That ambition explains why the campaign continued for 5 weeks across 26 of Iran's 31 provinces, striking everything from nuclear facilities to military airbases to state broadcaster headquarters to the parliament building. You do not hit a country's parliament building if your goal is a limited strike on a nuclear program. You hit it if your goal is to make the current governing structure of that country functionally unsustainable. Here is where the plan becomes both ambitious and deeply complicated. Because destroying an existing regional order is one thing. Building a new one requires every actor in the region to accept a fundamentally different set of power relationships. And several of those actors have competing ideas about what the new order should look like. The U.S. framework emerging from the 15-point proposal and the Islamabad talks involves several interconnected elements. Iran permanently abandons its nuclear enrichment program. Iran's ballistic missile program is severely constrained. Iran ends its financial and military support for the axis of resistance, meaning Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. In exchange, Iran receives sanctions relief and the possibility of normalized economic relations with the West. The Israel component of the new architecture is equally ambitious. Israel has been pursuing direct negotiations with Lebanon for the first time since the failed May 17 agreement in 1983. The Israel-Lebanon talks that began in April 2026 represented the first direct diplomatic engagement between the two countries in decades. The U.S. State Department published the terms of the 10-day Lebanon ceasefire framework, which explicitly called for Hezbollah to be disarmed and for Lebanon's legitimate state security forces to exercise exclusive control over Lebanese territory. That is not a modest ask. Hezbollah has been a de facto military and political power in Lebanon for 4 decades. Disarming it would reshape Lebanon's entire internal political balance. Israel's defense minister issued what he called an enforcement plan, stating that since the October 7, 2023 attacks, Iran is no longer immune to Israeli action, and that any attempt to reconstitute its ballistic missile or nuclear programs would be met with immediate military response. SI's analysts noted that because Iran now lacks viable air defenses, Israel can and likely will bomb Iranian facilities in the future, even if there is a ceasefire in the near term. That assessment effectively describes permanent Israeli military dominance over Iranian airspace as a feature of the new regional architecture rather than a temporary condition. This is the new Middle East plan in its broadest form. A region where Iran cannot threaten Israel or American allies with nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. A region where Hezbollah is disarmed and the Lebanese state actually governs its own territory. A region where the Houthis in Yemen are no longer a functioning military threat to Red Sea shipping. A region where Hamas does not control Gaza. And a region where the Strait of Hormuz functions as an international waterway rather than an Iranian weapon. Every single one of those objectives faces enormous practical obstacles. And understanding those obstacles is the only way to answer the question in the title of this analysis. Trump's description of Iran's government as seriously fractured is not diplomatic language. It is an intelligence assessment that explains why the second round of Islamabad talks collapsed before they even started. Mojtaba Khamenei was elevated to supreme leader on March 8, 2026 following his father's assassination on February 28. He inherited a country under active military assault, a shattered military command structure, a collapsing economy, and a population that had been experiencing major protests before the war even began. The New York Times reported in late March that Iran's leadership was paralyzed with severely disrupted decision-making processes and that damage to communications infrastructure had caused paranoia and internal power struggles. The result is that Iran currently has multiple centers of authority with different views on how to proceed. The new Supreme Leader's Office. The parliament led by Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, whose advisor publicly called Trump's ceasefire extension a ploy to buy time for a surprise strike. President Pezeshkian's office. The IRGC leadership. And the foreign ministry led by Abbas Araghchi, who has been the public face of Iran's negotiating posture. These centers of authority do not share a unified negotiating position. That is why Iran sent different versions of its 10-point proposal with differences between the Persian and English versions and inconsistencies across different statements from different officials. That is why Iranian negotiators went silent for days before the ceasefire deadline. And that is why Trump extended the ceasefire without a deadline, citing the need to wait for Iran to come up with a unified proposal. A fractured adversary is not necessarily easier to negotiate with. In some ways it is harder. You cannot make a deal with a government that cannot internally agree on its own position. And you cannot enforce a deal if the faction that agreed to it does not have the authority to implement it across the entire state apparatus. U.S. officials privately acknowledged to CNN that Trump's decision to extend rather than resume strikes reflected a calculation that bombing a fractured government risks causing complete state collapse in Iran. Complete state collapse in a country of 90 million people sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves and controlling the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz is not a managed outcome. It is a regional catastrophe that makes every other problem in the Middle East harder to solve. While the Iran negotiations remain stalled, the Israel-Lebanon track has moved faster than almost anyone predicted. And what happens there will serve as the test case for whether the new regional architecture Washington and Tel Aviv are trying to build can actually function. The 10-day ceasefire that began on April 16 represented the first direct Israeli-Lebanese diplomatic engagement in more than 4 decades. Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Yehiel Leiter and Lebanese ambassador Nada Hamadeh sat across the table from each other at the State Department with Secretary of State Marco Rubio present. That meeting alone was historically significant regardless of what comes from it. Lebanon's Prime Minister Nawaf Salam articulated his government's position with unusual clarity. A sovereign state cannot exist without the arms monopoly, he said. That statement was directed at Hezbollah. Salam's government is not seeking confrontation with Hezbollah, but it is not going to be intimidated either. The Lebanese government's demands from Israel include complete Israeli troop withdrawal from southern Lebanon, the return of Lebanese prisoners, and the ability of displaced civilians to go home. Israel's position is equally clear and deeply problematic for the Lebanese side. Israel has stated it will not withdraw its troops from their current positions in southern Lebanon during the ceasefire. Its military issued an evacuation advisory telling displaced Lebanese in certain areas not to return because Israeli forces were not pulling out. Netanyahu described the ceasefire as a step along the way to achieving all objectives, not as an endpoint. Hezbollah is the central unresolved problem in the Lebanon equation. The ceasefire framework calls for Hezbollah to be disarmed and for Lebanese state forces to assume exclusive control of national defense. Hezbollah was not a signatory to the agreement. Its political bloc called the Lebanese government's approach a path of concessions and submission to the enemy's will. Hezbollah fighters violated the ceasefire by launching rockets at Israeli positions in Rab Thalathan and a drone into northern Israel on April 21. Israel responded by targeting Hezbollah rocket launchers. The pattern is identical to what happened with the Russia-Ukraine Easter ceasefire. Agreement in principle. Violations within hours. Mutual blame. No mechanism for enforcement. And a fundamental underlying disagreement about what the agreement was actually supposed to achieve. Hezbollah disarmament is not achievable through a 10-day ceasefire framework. It may not be achievable at all without either a comprehensive Iranian deal that removes Tehran's support for the organization or a sustained Lebanese state-building effort that gives Hezbollah's political constituency a reason to accept integration into the Lebanese state rather than continued resistance. Neither of those conditions currently exists. Every diplomatic track in the new Middle East plan eventually runs into the same wall. Iran's nuclear program and specifically Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. Before the war began, Iran held approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. If further enriched to 90% weapons-grade, that material would be sufficient for as many as 10 nuclear weapons. The IAEA acknowledged that Iran's accumulation of near-weapons-grade material had no clear civilian justification. U.S. intelligence assessments put Iran's breakout time at a few weeks, meaning the time needed to enrich enough material for one bomb. B-2 bombers struck Fordow, Natanz and Isfahan with 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator bombs during the campaign. The Fordow facility, according to U.S. assessments, was rendered inoperable. But here is the problem that neither Trump's victory declarations nor the ceasefire negotiations have resolved. The enriched uranium was not destroyed. Its location is not fully confirmed. The IAEA has been unable to resume inspections in Iran since the war began. A U.S. assessment found that last year's Operation Midnight Hammer destroyed only one of 3 Iranian nuclear sites. Trump stated on April 8 that there will be no enrichment of uranium and that the U.S. will work with Iran to remove all deeply buried nuclear material. He later acknowledged that removing enriched uranium from Iran will be a long and difficult process. Iran has stated it will not allow the uranium to leave the country. Vance said the first round of Islamabad talks broke down specifically because Iran would not commit to foregoing a nuclear weapon. SI's analysts noted that Iran has enough human capital to resume nuclear work after the shooting stops. It can rebuild its enrichment infrastructure given time and resources. The question of whether the new Middle East plan succeeds or fails may ultimately come down to whether Iran's enriched uranium stockpile can be accounted for and whether Iran can be permanently and verifiably prevented from reconstituting the program that was damaged but not eliminated by the military campaign. No ceasefire framework currently addresses that question in a way that both sides accept. Trump described his decision to maintain the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports even while extending the ceasefire as the critical remaining pressure point in the negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated publicly that in a matter of days Karg Island storage will be full and Iran's fragile oil wells will be shut in. The blockade is designed to prevent Iran from generating the oil revenue it needs to fund its reconstruction and survive the economic pressure of the war. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi called the continued blockade an act of war and a violation of the existing ceasefire. Iran's parliament advisor called it no different from bombardment and said it must be met with a military response. These are not just rhetorical statements. They reflect the genuine Iranian position that the ceasefire cannot hold if the economic siege that is equivalent to continued warfare in Tehran's view remains in place. The blockade creates a strategic dilemma for both sides. For the U.S., maintaining it keeps maximum pressure on Iran and creates economic incentives for Tehran to reach a deal quickly. But maintaining it also gives Iran's hardliners the argument that the U.S. is not negotiating in good faith and that a unified Iranian response including military action is justified. And it prevents the Strait of Hormuz from fully reopening, which keeps global oil prices elevated and creates political pressure on Trump domestically through higher gasoline prices. JP Morgan analyst Natasha Keneva assessed that the blockade may add leverage in negotiations, but only if it is strictly enforced and sustained over a longer horizon, likely on the order of multiple months. Multiple months of blockade means multiple months of elevated global energy prices. That is a cost being paid by every country on earth that imports oil, not just by Iran. The blockade is both the most effective tool Washington currently has and the most economically painful one to maintain for everyone involved. The new Middle East architecture being designed in Washington and Tel Aviv is not just about Iran. The Gulf Arab states that were themselves struck by Iranian missiles and drones during the conflict have their own calculations about what the new regional order should look like. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait and Qatar all absorbed Iranian strikes during the war. The UAE said Iranian attacks killed 3 people and wounded 94. Dubai International Airport, one of the world's busiest, was temporarily closed after drone strikes. Qatar, which hosts the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East at Al Udeid, faced Iranian strikes despite having maintained diplomatic relations with Tehran. 2 Iranian Su-24 bombers were reportedly shot down by Qatar's own air force. These countries want Iranian military capacity permanently reduced. They want the axis of resistance dismantled. They want a regional order in which Iran cannot threaten them through proxy forces or direct strikes. In that sense, their strategic interests align with Washington's and Tel Aviv's stated objectives. But they also have their own complicated relationship with the post-war architecture. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince MBS has been pursuing normalization with Israel under the Abraham Accords framework. A comprehensive Iran deal that legitimizes a diminished but surviving Iranian regime could actually accelerate that normalization by removing the primary security threat that made Saudi-Israeli cooperation strategically necessary. The Gulf states are also watching the Hormuz situation extremely carefully. Their own oil exports pass through the strait. A permanent Iranian toll booth regime that charges ships per transit would increase the cost of every barrel of oil they export. The economic architecture of the new Middle East order matters to them as much as the military architecture. The new Middle East plan being constructed by Washington and Tel Aviv has to contend with 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council who have fundamental objections to the entire framework. China has been deeply involved in the ceasefire diplomacy. Trump acknowledged that China helped get Iran to negotiate. Chinese maritime companies brokered transit payments through the IRGC toll booth system in yuan. Chinese vessels were among the first to transit the controlled Hormuz corridor after the ceasefire. China has enormous economic interests in Iranian oil and in the stability of the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of its energy supply flows. China's position on the new regional architecture is that it does not want a US-dominated Middle East in which American military power permanently constrains Iran's nuclear program and removes Iranian military capacity. That outcome strengthens U.S. leverage over Chinese energy supply chains and sets a precedent for American preemptive military action against countries pursuing nuclear programs that China finds strategically uncomfortable given its own relationship with countries like North Korea and its tensions with Taiwan. Russia is even more directly opposed to the new architecture. Moscow reportedly aided Tehran as Iranian drones targeted U.S. bases across the Gulf region, according to Atlantic Council analysis. Russia has been watching an American military campaign successfully destroy the air defense systems that Russia itself sold to Iran and that were supposed to demonstrate the effectiveness of Russian military exports. The collapse of Iranian air defenses under American stealth technology is an advertisement for U.S. military capability and a damaging demonstration of Russian military equipment's limitations. Both China and Russia have UN Security Council veto power. Any binding international framework for the new Middle East order that requires UN Security Council endorsement will face structural opposition from both. That constraint limits the tools available to make any agreements durable. Is the war over, or is a new one beginning? The honest answer as of April 22, 2026 is that the old war is not definitively over and the conditions for the new one are already taking shape simultaneously. The Old War. Iran's nuclear program is damaged, but its enriched uranium stockpile is unaccounted for and the IAEA cannot inspect. Iran's military capacity is severely degraded, but Iran's new supreme leader is establishing authority. The ceasefire has been extended without a deadline. The naval blockade continues. Iran's parliament advisor says the blockade must be met with a military response. 2 ships were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz on April 22 according to Britannica's live updates, complicating diplomatic efforts. The Islamabad second round has not happened because Iran has not confirmed its delegation. The new conflict being shaped. Israel has declared that it will bomb Iranian facilities in the future if the nuclear or missile programs are reconstituted. Hezbollah violated the Lebanon ceasefire within days of it taking effect. Israel maintains troops inside southern Lebanon with no withdrawal timeline. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again on April 18 in response to the naval blockade. Iran's IRGC threatened to target oil facilities in neighboring countries if the U.S. resumed strikes. China moved to block the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, apparently in parallel with the Iran crisis, in a development that suggests Beijing is watching the precedents being set very carefully. The new Middle East plan that Israel and the U.S. are trying to build is real in its ambition and partially achieved in its military execution. Iran's military architecture has been fundamentally degraded. The conditions for a regional order in which Iran cannot threaten its neighbors through proxies or nuclear ambiguity are more achievable now than at any point in the past 4 decades. But the plan requires Iran to accept a permanent reduction in its regional power and sovereignty in ways that no Iranian government, regardless of how fractured, can publicly agree to without facing an internal legitimacy crisis. It requires Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah, which Lebanon's government has been trying and failing to do for 30 years. It requires a nuclear settlement that satisfies both American requirements for zero enrichment and Iranian domestic political needs to claim some form of national dignity from a war that killed its supreme leader and destroyed its military. None of those requirements are close to being met. The ceasefire is holding barely. The blockade is continuing. Iran's government is fractured and silent. And the region is watching a situation where the old architecture was destroyed and the new one has not yet been built. The war produced a military result. The peace has not yet produced a political one. And until it does, the question of whether what is happening is the end of the old war or the beginning of the new one will remain exactly as open as it is today. Is the war over, or is a new one beginning? As of April 22, 2026, the honest answer is this: the old war is not fully over, and the conditions for a new one are already forming at the same time. Iran's nuclear program has been damaged, but the enriched uranium is still unaccounted for. The ceasefire has been extended, yet the naval blockade continues, and attacks have taken place in the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, the signs of a new conflict are clear. Israel says it will strike again in the future. Hezbollah has violated the ceasefire. Iran is threatening to target oil facilities. The war has produced a military result, but peace has not produced a political solution. So the real question remains: is this the end of one war, or the beginning of a much bigger one?